So, welcome back after the coffee break. So the third panel of Europe in Discourse 3 is the EU as an international actor. We have three distinguished speakers with us today. Professor Evanthis Hatzivassiliou, head of the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Athens. Federico Romero, we met him yesterday, the European University Institute, and Zohar Kampf from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So I'm going to start with Professor Hatzivassiliou, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Themis. Dear friends, the European Union is not a conventional international actor. It is neither a state nor an intergovernmental organization. We all know that the state is required to have a foreign policy, but the intergovernmental organization can have no policy of its own. It's the lowest common denominator of its members. However, as the globe's only supranational organization, the EU falls in neither category. As a supranational entity, it is required to have an attitude towards international developments, more so since the early 1990s and the Treaty of Maastricht. This creates strong contradictions in the EU's international presence, namely a picture of both power and weakness. The EU is the largest trading power in the world. It has a population of 450 million people, even after Brexit, and a GNP of $17 trillion, the second largest in the globe, second only to the American, and still considerably above the Chinese. It is also a leader in science and technology. On the other hand, the lack of a hierarchical administration such as the one of a state inevitably creates in the EU hiccups, delays, and internal disagreements. The anxiety of the EU institutions during the 2003 Iraq War speaks for itself, and we all know Kissinger's famous aphorism when he wondered to whom to call when he wanted to speak to the Foreign Minister of Europe. The lack of a credible deterrent became obvious for all to see when Brexit reduced the fact that one country left the European Union reduced almost by half the EU's military and intelligence capabilities. So in my paper, I will discuss the orientation, weaknesses, and limits of the EU's international policies. I will depart from the thesis that, unlike intergovernmental organization, the EU needs to have a foreign policy. If nothing else, the EU itself has explicitly accepted this in the post-Maastricht era. I will consider some hiccups as expected and as deriving from the Union's multinational character. However, I will also claim that its current international policies are obsolete and inadequate, and they maximize the given malfunctions of a cumbersome international structure. Now, the EU's contemporary role in international affairs, Federico spoke to us about it yesterday in a brilliant way. So the EU's contemporary role was shaped in the 1970s and 80s when it acted admirably during the southern enlargement, during the Greek and Iberian accessions. The idea was that the community would use the prospect of full accession in order to facilitate the democratic transitions of these states and stabilize them in the West. Democratization and modernization were the key concepts. So the community learned to use its soft power as a very efficient mechanism for the furthering of democratic institutions within the continent. The same was done after the end of the Cold War with the countries of East Central Europe. It was a Europe that used the human rights agenda to breach the Iron Curtain. A Europe finally reunited after the end of the Cold War, indeed reunited through peaceful revolutions, the dream of European liberals since time immemorial. So Europe had found its political role as a democratic acceleration. At the same time, aid to developing countries was also a major field of the community's involvement in foreign affairs. aid was marked by the 1963 Yaoundé Agreement and the 1975 Lomé Convention. This was an ingenious option in the international context of that time, namely of the late Cold War and the early post-Cold War period. There was a kind of division of labor between components of the West. NATO was being called upon to deal with hard security issues, and the EU would only deploy soft power, the economy, negotiations, the acquis communautaire, and aid. Of course, no international process works ideally, and during the Cold War there were important disagreements, sometimes dangerous for the cohesion of the West, involving the difficulties of coordination between NATO and the community, such as the disputes on out-of-area issues during the Yom Kippur War, and mostly, I think, the dispute over the West Siberian pipeline in 1982. On the whole, however, the system worked well. During the period of détente and of negotiations with the Soviet Union, it was the US that dealt with strategic arms limitation talks and the mutual and ballast force reduction, while the community members mostly handled the discussions in the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe on other issues such as trade, the environment, and human rights. However, no system, well, in our case, it's less than a system, it's a practical arrangement, really. Anyway, no system works forever. The kaleidoscopic nature of international affairs makes it imperative that the actors continuously evaluate and readjust their policies. Arguably, this did not happen in the case of Europe, despite the big words about the common foreign and security policy since the early 1990s. The truth is that no common policy ever emerged. The common policy was an intergovernmental, thus not supranational, process requiring unanimity among member states. Due to the lack of a credible common adversary, the lack of a military threat, it finally came to define foreign trade policies and aid to third countries. Once more, it was policies focusing exclusively on soft power. Moreover, after 1991, the European public, perhaps relaxed following a very turbulent 20th century, developed a strong aversion to security, as well as an understanding that these things, international affairs, are dirty business, a conservative notion unworthy of the enlightened postmodernity that the Union represents. There was, of course, a measure of hypocrisy in this phenomenon. Both the EU and the European public were taking for granted and pretended to turn a blind eye to the fact that Europe was being covered by NATO and the US nuclear umbrella. From 1989 until the early 2010s, we, the Europeans, have had our interval of relaxation with strong growth rates, the dividend of peace after the end of the Cold War, and with no state threatening us. There were, of course, security problems, terrorism, but these did not require the deployment of large tactical forces. Yet, ideal situations rarely appear in human history, and even if they do not last long. Insecurities have once more appeared in our days, and this raises the stakes for Europe. Moreover, in case we have not observed it, since the late 2000s, other great powers ascended, China first, and then a resurgent Russia, as we saw in its wars with Georgia and now with the Ukraine. Acting responsibly as a great power is a European responsibility. It's not an optional extra for Europe. It is imperative, therefore, in order to ensure the security of the contemporary world and the smooth development of the international system. Now, in this new context, there seems to be an important deficit in the EU's perceptions and policies. The EU has learned to use very efficiently the lure of accession in order to stabilize countries that wanted to become full members. But now the EU will increasingly need to deal also with actors who do not necessarily want to become full members. Towards such states, the present EU policies are simply irrelevant. The EU international methodology and self-perception remains the same as the one shaped in the 1970s and 80s at a different era. It is obsolete, ineffective, and sometimes even self-referential. In this context, I believe that the major European problem does not lie in the international system. It is a problem coming from within. The European Union and many of its member states, not all its member states, but many of its member states, have simply forgotten how to make foreign policy. They are under the illusion that the only enlightened foreign policy is Europeanization and democratization, and the only proper foreign policy tools are soft power and aid. Allow me to be a little more bold and suggest that of these member states who have forgotten how to make foreign policy, the greatest responsibility, in my view, belongs to Germany, the largest of the EU members. Of course, one can understand the hesitation of Germany to undertake active roles internationally, but the problem is that Berlin imposed the same hesitation in the EU policies themselves. Moreover, Berlin proved painfully contradictory. Projecting an enlightened perspective of rejecting hard power options, it failed to support a common European stance internationally. And at the same time, Berlin effectively pursued a crudely nationalistic foreign economic policy. Germany's concern was how to sell toasters and cars or weapons to any country of dubious international behavior, including Russia, even at the cost of neglecting common European interests. And I repeat, Berlin is a leader, and a leader has a greater responsibility than the others. The result was largely what we have witnessed in the case of the war in the Ukraine. Germany managed to become and to make the EU so dependent for energy on a third party, Russia, that when the EU, under German leadership, declared an economic war against Russia, it managed to lose it. It managed to lose an economic war by a state, Russia, with a GNP less than Spain's alone. This is a measure of failure in international affairs. To be fair, I need to note that Berlin was not alone in the EU taking this attitude, and there are signs that our German partners are in the process of re-examining their policy. On the other hand, to say that the EU is incomplete in terms of defense and foreign policy is not enough. I would therefore like to make a few more observations on the ways that the EU could address these problems. In this endeavor, it is important not to deviate from moderate realism. We need to think what Europe can do in order to support its great power status without losing its essence as a democratic entity. Moreover, it is not realistic to consider impossible or dangerous options such as a detachment from NATO or a strategic detachment from the US. Still, some things have to be done, have to change, and I hope that we all understand this following the war in the Ukraine. Now, NATO, one of the major manifestations of the West, must remain the main tool of European security, but this does not mean that the Union or its member states can continue their policy of relaxation and their, allow me to say, hypocritical rejection of the concept of hard power. To give you an indicative example, we know that the EU will, by 2025, deploy a rapid deployment capacity of 5,000 troops. Dear friends, this is a joke. An entity of 450 million people with the second largest GNP in the globe surely can do better than this. What will 5,000 men do? In 1964, at the time of Greek-Turkish military confrontation in Cyprus, Greece, then an underdeveloped country of 9 million people, sent a force of 8,000 troops to Cyprus. I'm not supporting that Greek decision. In fact, I have strongly criticized it in my works, but it is really a joke that the mighty EU can do less than that, and only by 2025. I mean, Putin must be laughing at us. Second, the EU does not need to ignore or break up with NATO. It does not need to turn itself into a military superpower with a huge standing army, but it should learn to, or at least get used to, developing a common stance and upholding its external borders. This does not mean the creation of a conservative fortress Europe or a cessation of its enlargement processes, or even worse, an attitude of white supremacy. For God's sake, no. But the EU is a union acting in a given international context. International actors have borders and interests and are willing to hold them. If the EU, giving into unrealistic fantasies, wants to ignore this fact, it will simply become the laughingstock of everybody else. We in the EU could perhaps have the fantasy of representing postmodernity, but the others are dangerously modern or even dangerously traditional. If we manage to understand that we have common interests of the traditional type, we will not betray our open-minded or even open-ended processes. If nothing else, we should stop being hypocritical on this level as well. When in 2015, the countries of Central Europe who did not want the refugees coming through Greece closed the borders with Greece, they knew very well how to demand that Athens protects the external borders of Europe. The same demands applies with regard to immigration, with regard to Spain, Italy, Malta, or Cyprus. Sometimes we uphold our external borders when we want to, but sometimes we ignore it. A third requirement involves the intellectual level. Perhaps this is my most difficult observation. A foreign and security policy in our days is not something which is shaped only in the relatively small communities of the experts of the foreign and the defense ministries. This policy is based on study and diffusion and involves also public opinion, debate, and accountability. I wonder, dear friends, how much of this abundance of funding for EU research projects in the past 10 years have been directed to these more traditional subjects of foreign and defense policy, either of the Union or the Member States. In my view, nowhere has this postmodernist neglect of foreign policy by the EU, and nowhere has the EU's thinly concealed hostility towards the idea of foreign security policy have become more apparent than in the Union's funding of research in the past years. We are constructing communities of experts on anything other than foreign policy. Indeed, we are constructing communities of experts who are hostile to the notion of foreign policy. And obviously, our public's aversion towards these fields have been strengthened. But if we do not think about foreign policy, if we do not examine its origins and fundamentals, how can we expect to have one when we suddenly need it on the 24th of February 2022 when Russia invades the Ukraine? Now, in conclusion, it is not just Russia. I personally am disappointed to see European debates on how to deal with Chinese penetration of our region. I mean, the choice of the word is very clear, penetration of our regions, as if we are merely passive actors facing the interdictions of others. This is unworthy, I think, of Europe and of the thing that it represents. However, foreign policy and defense cannot be made lightheartedly because of a sudden explosion of publicity like the one we see because of the Ukraine. Foreign policy and defense need to be organized carefully and take a lot of time and intellectual effort. A security policy is based on a comprehensive perception of the world, on a strategic dogma, and on the ability and determination of an actor to wield power, both hard and soft. It is also based on the perception that we have common interests, even, why not, a European national interest. If we are perceived by others as having no common interests, then effectively we do not have them. Since the time of the first organized human settlements in prehistoric Mesopotamia, military power and the structured foreign policy have been necessary complements of the international position of an actor. No one can be a great power through soft power only. There are important adjustments, therefore, that the EU must make in its international conduct and mostly in its internal organization and mentalities. It is going to be difficult, but it still has to be done. International affairs, dear friends, as we all know, is a relentless place. Stalin was clearly wrong when he asked how many divisions the Pope had, but he was no less dangerous for this reason. I hope that no one in our days will think about asking how many divisions Josep Borrell has, because then the answer will be a rapid deployment capacity of 5,000 men by 2025. It will really be miserable and unworthy of Europe. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I will move pretty much along the path that Evanthis opened. First, because I, by and large, agree with his analysis and also his argument, to which I would add a couple of points to the list of reasons why moving forward towards Europe, assuming some determined, maybe not extremely large, but certainly determined strategic, both mentality and set of tools, and of course foreign policy coordination is necessary. One is that an element that has always been puzzling in the EU, EC first in EU, then foreign policy, is the way in which we took pride of how enlargement worked to not only incorporate but some other countries, but also stabilized entire areas on the borders of Europe, which is absolutely right. What we always overlooked, to the point of almost not studying, not analyzing, was how enlargement, whether in formal terms or in more informal expansion of trade and financial or sometimes soft policy role, produced also negative effects on the other side of the borders, on those who were not incorporated. Mm-hmm. Because when you move a border, inevitably you produce effects on both sides of this border. We neglected the effects on the other side for a long time, including, I think, in the macroscopic example of the issue between Ukraine and Russia and the way in which we will, because we will sooner or later, start reconsidering how we got to this point. I'm of two minds, frankly, and I'm not sure what historians of the future will make of the way in which this crisis came into existence. And I'm not interested in an issue of attributing responsibilities at this point. The responsibility for starting the war is so obvious and so clear that that would be a silly debate. But it's fairly obvious that you have a diplomacy, in large terms, of extending influence, indirect influence, for instance, towards Ukraine. You have to take into account from the very beginning the type of tools and resources, including power resources, that you can deploy if things go wrong, if the interlocutor gets really pissed off, as he did. If the interlocutor is a big power. Of course, if the interlocutor is Liechtenstein, let's say, you might not consider its resources very strongly, even though Liechtenstein's financial resources might be problematic sometimes. But if you're dealing with Russia, you have to, at least mentally and analytically, consider the option. What resources do I have if things go wrong? And of course, we didn't do that. And the results are evident to everyone. The second point, I'm a bit surprised that Evanthis didn't mention, because he knows very well what we're talking about, is that the complete reliance on NATO as it is, that is a US-centered NATO, US power-centered NATO, implies a type of United States that we have seen for half a century, we might still see, but we're not sure we're going to see it again. Trump was not a blip. Not only because Trump himself may be coming back, but because we've seen the transformation of the Republican Party into a nationalist radical party that is far less committed to the type of transatlantic order and system that we are used to. So at least in terms of a fallback option, Europeans should consider the possibility of what is our security going to be if NATO is to be led by an administration, a political system in which one part of the system, and a substantial part of the system, has shifted onto a far from transatlantic, security-oriented mind. But much as I am a fan of as a citizen, first and foremost, of the notion of the EU stepping up to take a strategic role, to have a geopolitical influence as well as a financial and economic one, to take on tasks of security and defense in a far more substantial and relevant way, I feel skeptical about it for two sets of reasons that I would like to discuss here. Aside from the well-known, deeply rooted national defense of sovereignty and control in military terms that more or less all the European states still remain fairly jealous about. The first is that the split that we are observing nowadays in Europe between those countries that are strongly, determinedly fixed on engaging the war with Russia with all means possible, except direct military intervention, to produce an outright defeat of Russia on the field and a sort of regression, degradation of Russian power for a long time. The Baltic countries, Poland, UK, some voices from the Scandinavian countries, not so far the official government's position as far as I can tell, but certainly several voices that come out of Scandinavian countries, seems to have formed a kind of axis, if we can use this term, that stretches horizontally over the northern coast of Europe and reaches the US, in which their strategy is degradation of Russian power in the long term. How we get there is not clear. They don't make it clear, except pushing the Ukrainians, helping the Ukrainians to push the Russians as far back as possible. What is the end point of this game? It remains to be seen. I think the discussion we heard previously in the keynote speech was very interesting in this respect and should not be avoided because it's a discussion that sooner or later has to happen, but we don't know where we're going. On the other hand, we have countries in which majority of voices have expressed not so much outright reservations against this hard line against Russia, but a more balanced attitude, more prudent, if you want, more timid, perhaps, attitude that says, since a compromise got to be reached sooner or later, we might as well start to discuss it. Russia should not be humiliated, etc., etc., etc. Out of the way to the extreme nationalist voices that say, no, we are paying for the sanctions more than the Russians are paying, and so on and so forth. Now, aside from these stark polarizations around the issue of the Ukrainian war, it seems to me that these polarizations also reflect an older, less evident, but still existent and deep divide within the European Union between not so much specific group of countries, but necessarily attitudes, priorities in foreign policies that have made almost impossible to have a unified foreign policy view, except around issues of values, trade, etc., etc. After all, the divides that we have seen on migration issues between the Mediterranean countries and the other countries are also the reflection of a divide between those who have, for 20 years now, prioritized a foreign policy that looked at containing Russia first and foremost, and those who thought that this was not the main priority, that priorities were others. And understandably so, because for Greece, Italy, Spain, to a certain extent even France, the priority was not containing Russia. The priority was to a large extent issues of how you deal with the Islamic world, with North Africa, with the Mediterranean, etc., etc. So one of the reasons why we didn't get to these desirable advancements towards a more cohesive European Union with a foreign policy and a strategic dimension is also that the definition of a foreign policy strategy and foreign policy priorities was not so easy at all. And had we pushed the debate to the ground for actual decisions, I think the splits that we see nowadays in the discussion about the Ukrainian war would probably have surfaced already before. And I think this is something that cuts across European history, because Europe is a continent that is also geographically exposed to a variety of fronts, if we want to use these terms. Atlantic, Mediterranean, African, Middle Eastern, Russia. So pulling together all these strings into a cohesive foreign policy strategy, a set of priorities, wouldn't be easy, even in the best of conditions, and it certainly is not now. The second issue, the second problem, the second obstacle, if you want, is, of course, called NATO. Why that? European integration has always had a very ambivalent, as we know, relationship with NATO. First and foremost, because NATO came first. And that's a crucial issue. European integration came about because NATO was there, because the Atlantic Alliance was there. It's hard to imagine, the reconciliation between France and Germany and the type of integrations we got without the existence of an Atlantic Alliance, of the American security guarantee in the first place. So the existence of the Atlantic Alliance enabled European integration in its origins and its early developments. But of course, it also undermined the possibility that this early integration moved onto the terrain of political and defense union right away. Not so much, I'm not one of those who think, the Americans sabotaged this, oh no, the Brits were responsible. But for the very simple fact that the existence of a working military alliance and strategic perspective that was transatlantic made the move towards European defense be felt as not urgent, necessary, inevitable. So when the European defense community sank in the French parliament, people said, oh, that's a pity, especially those with the federalist bent said, that's a pity. We will not have a federalist Europe in the short term. But, okay, we can live with it, because our defense is guaranteed, our belonging to the West is guaranteed, and we can take other paths of European integration in terms of market, trade, agriculture, blah, blah, blah. So this set the matrix, in a way. And this matrix persisted for a long time, and it still persists. Because, again, it's interesting here that the relationship between pattern and occasions that's spring up from historical change all of a sudden, sometimes unexpected. In a way, think the way in which German unification was conceived and realized very quick, in a matter of a few months. It was all based around NATO and the existence of NATO, not only because it was made by a very close entente between Bonn and Washington, between Kohl and Bush, but also because the way in which the belonging of the new united Germany to NATO was presented to the other interlocutors, Gorbachev to begin with, was one of the preconditions for the acceptance of this deal. The unification of Germany was depended on the existence of NATO. So this reproduced NATO as a pillar of the European constitution, if you will, material constitution, with the critical US role in it. And we've forgotten this, but another element that also replicated this pattern, this matrix, was the war in Yugoslavia. The war in Yugoslavia, the breaking up of Yugoslavia started with the European Union moving in diplomatically, saying, we'll fix the situation, okay? We'll take charge. Europe, post-Berlin Wall, post the Iron Curtain, is our business. We'll take charge of it. They tried. They couldn't stop the war. And what happened eventually was NATO to come in. NATO, and particularly American power, to come in and stop the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Stop. Well, more or less stop, but anyway, stop the major fighting, the major wars. So that re-legitimized, if there was a need for it, re-established NATO as the crucial pillar of the security in Europe, even post-1989, for a long time. And then for a generation, more or less, we could live with the type of situations that Evanthis was describing to us, the type of illusions, delusions that Europe entertained, also because we felt our back was covered by the type of post-1989, post-German unification, post-Yugoslavia war that the coexistence of the European Union and NATO defined in the new Europe. NATO was taking care of the security architecture, even though it wasn't particularly threatened for quite some time, but it was there. We knew it was there. And at the same time, the EU took the first most prominent role in terms of economic integration of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. It was a division of labor in many ways that was convenient, maybe not terribly wise in terms of long-term thinking, but very convenient, because each one did what it could do best, depending on its resources, practices, etc., etc. So again, for a generation, the eruption of history, in a way, by means of German unification and the Yugoslav war, replicated, gave you a new lease of life, and a powerful new lease of life to this system through which the European Union could live without taking up a direct strategic role, because in a way there was this coexistence of two organizations, two architectures, two structures. And I'm afraid that the war in Ukraine points to a new cycle of this kind. That is to say, the fact that we precipitated into the war between Ukraine and Russia, the war between Russia and Ukraine, to be honest, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, in a way makes clear the various points that Evanthis was listing of why we should need a far more determined and resourceful strategic attitude of the European Union. Whether it could have avoided the war, I mean, it's purely hypothetical. There's no real interest in discussing this hypothetical, but certainly it would not have made the situation worse and possibly could have made it better. But it wasn't there, and we are in the situation in which we are now. And the situation in which we are now makes very clear that in a complete, total way for a good deal of European states, Poland, the Baltics, the new entries into NATO, NATO is the thing. NATO is, the pillar of your defense, your security, the guarantee of future security. Anything that even hints to weakening NATO and NATO ties is going to be rejected by these governments, I think, in the coming future. And they will have the fairly strong, substantial, very relevant support of not only the UK, which matters anyway, but especially the US. So in that sense, the replication of a key primacy of NATO is inbuilt, at least in a good chunk of European governments. Second, the way in which this war will end, if it ends, it might drag on for God knows how long, maybe at a lower intensity level, maybe in a different scenario, but this will inevitably make for the presence, the role, especially of the United States' strength in terms of weapons, in terms of intelligence, in terms of perhaps threats that we don't know about that could very well be issued under the table on this nuclear problem, nuclear deterrence, etc., critical, vital, not only for the Ukrainians, but also for all those other countries that feel potentially directly threatened by Russian arms. So in a way, I think we are in for another long haul, maybe another generation period in which the centrality of NATO and the way in which this centrality is an obstacle to the creation of a EU strategic role will be there with us. It's an obstacle not so much because it's naturally an obstacle, because for several EU governments, that is the priority. And they would be very afraid that a strategic role by the EU could undermine, if not directly threaten, the relevance, centrality, and influence of NATO that for them is vital. I think that is going to be an obstacle. The variable here, what is the variable? The variable might be this process of German rearmament, because that's what we should call it, no? Shouldn't it? When so far they've simply decided to put an enormous amount of money on defense. Where it will go is not clear to me. I don't know whether it's clear already in their plans, but it's not been made very clear publicly. But wherever it will go is a massive rearmament of Germany. And it's also a very significant shift of perspectives that would influence other areas of German foreign policy, its set of priorities, the way in which they will deal with allies as well as with foes. So that's a variable that might change a lot of things. But again, let's project 5 years from now, 10 years from now, who feels confident enough to gamble that this massive rearmament of Germany will go into the direction of compacting a EU strategic role rather than strengthening the main transatlantic NATO axis. German history points to the second, but perhaps things change. But that seems to me the variable. The final point I think that we want to make, I think Evanthis was also mentioning that, is that one of the paradoxes that the projection of financial and economic influence, if not power, by the EU worldwide, in the absence of a strategic role and a strategic mentality and a strategic culture, is the way in which we're dealing about the issues in the Pacific. That in a way, if you think, is strange. I mean, in the Pacific, there is brewing up a conflict, very large, direct, massive, between China and the US, which is about influencing that sphere in that ocean and on those coasts. But those are our two main economic partners, by far. The most important economic partners of the EU. The EU has a huge, huge interest in the destinies of China and the US because our economy is, totally interdependent with those. And yet, do we have even a foreign policy line, voice on the issues there? Yes, we have a more or less principled adherence to Biden's discourse of democracies versus autocracy, but after all, the role, if we can call it a role, of the European Union countries in all this brewing up of a huge contest and conflict in the Pacific boils down to which country will sell 3 submarines to Australia. No more than that in terms of European presence there. And again, we're not talking about Antarctica. We are talking about our critical, crucial, massive economic partners without whom the future of the European economy is simply unthinkable at the moment. So the reasons to go in that direction are many, are strong, are in many ways, I think, vital for the future, but the obstacle to get there are almost equally high and historically determined and very deeply rooted. So I think I feel very torn between necessity and conscience of possibility in this respect. Thank you very much.
And now to something completely different, hopefully thought-provoking as your presentations. I'm going to move from, thank you. I'm going to move from a normative analysis of the situation to linguistic functional analysis of the construction of European identity as an actor. This is a work in progress, and I would like to thank you, Themis and Juliana, for inviting me, because it allowed me to rethink about my previous work in the context of the crisis in Ukraine. And I will talk about the construction of European identity, actors' identity, through a pedantic rhetoric, which is the rhetoric of shame and blame, condemnation and commendation. I will focus today mainly on condemnations, but I will touch here and there on points on commendation and especially on words of support. And I will do that in order to understand how European identity is constructed, challenged, and negotiated through value-based discourse. And the cases under scrutiny, my previous research on condemnation of Israeli policy in the Palestinian territories, and the crisis in Ukraine, the Russian invasion into Ukraine. My starting point is the connection, the relations between speech acts and identity. Speech acts are the basic units of communication and serves as a means to construct the world with words, according to Austin. They are related to normative scripts and conventions that bind the society together, and as such, they serve as speech acts. Public speech acts serve as an efficient tool to study socio-political identities, transformation, and formation. At the individual level, at the speaker level, their deontic power commits speakers to what they say, and thus serves as a litmus paper to understand one's own systems of values, their social, political, and moral positioning vis-a-vis actions of others, events, and other actors, in or outside the communities. At the society level, and here you can see a quote from linguist Robin Lakoff, speech acts, speech acts that are located in a specific cultural and societal time and place allow us to understand a great deal about who we are, what we want, and the rules and the assumptions that bind us together as a society or as a community or of sort. Two speech acts that are especially useful in studying the formation and transformation of identities are condemnations and commendations. Condemnation and blame in more general terms, and commendations and statements of support, statements of solidarity. Condemnations are expressive speech acts that manifest speaker critical stance toward some violation committed by a specific actor or entailed by an institutional policy. This is the definition of condemnations, according to Searle, and my own work with Professor Shoshana Blum-Kulka. And here you see a classic condemnation by the EU, who resolutely condemns Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Statements of solidarity and commendations are commendations in general and statements of support are solidarity-oriented speech acts that manifest the speaker's supportive stance towards others. And we heard plenty of them during the crisis. Both speech acts, statements of solidarity and statements and condemnations, are the building blocks of a pedantic rhetoric, a rhetoric of blame and praise, which promotes values of equality and human respect on the one hand, and disparages those social actors who violate them on the other. Most importantly, in assigning novelty or baseness to public actors and their actions, a pedantic rhetoric sets up model for conduct and thereby reinforces shared cultural values and traditions. So, as I told you, my main emphasis will be on condemnation, and this is because this is the prime example of a pedantic rhetoric, or the pedantic of blames, which involves a strategy, the use of condemnations. They represent a strategy dubbed as, or called as, mobilizing shame by human rights organizations. It serves as a dominant metaphor through which these human rights organizations understand their work. The mobilizing shame strategy is a double articulation. It seeks to trigger a sense of recognition and remorse on the transgressor's part, and to mobilize public support for the negative evaluation of the transgressor's conduct. Two of the most common strategies, discursive strategies associated with mobilizing shame today are unsettling visual images, as we all see on a daily basis on television, and political condemnations, which serves to publicize the violation of widely accepted norms or rules. This condemnation addresses transnational audiences who are reminded of what is right or permissible and what is considered wrong or sanctionable in human affairs. The ritualistic realization of these public condemnations turns them into teachable moments for communities, moments that bear witness to the affirmation or renegotiation of moral stances and ethical choices. As public speech acts, condemnations, the performativity of condemnation can be identified in several areas, as I mentioned here. They are publicizing violation of widely accepted rules of conduct proposed to delegitimize transgressor, reaffirms norms, redefine relationship between the condemner and the condemned party, and what is most crucial for this presentation, they map moral affiliation. Map moral affiliation over space, and this is a map of those who, the world map of those who voted against or abstained from condemning Russia. And all the white areas, of course, are those who condemned Russia, but you can see who is the rest, who are the members of the West, and who are the members of the rest. So these are the speech acts of condemnation, and I will briefly present, before discussing the Russian-Ukrainian case, I will briefly present my previous work with Tamar Katwiel, a linguistic anthropologist from Haifa University. And we analyzed political condemnation against Israeli violations of human rights in the Palestinian territories. We chose four organizations that takes different roles, or they have different relationship with the Israeli state. B'Tselem, a human rights Israeli organization. BDS, a Palestinian-led transnational organization, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, and two official organizations, the UN and the EU Council. And this was in fact the first study that specifically concentrated on the speech act of condemnation, right? So we tried first to understand what are the discursive strategies, what are the components of condemnations, and the second question is how the condemned relationship affect the speech act of condemnation, the realization of condemnation. So we analyzed the mission statements of these organizations and the 210 items, speech acts of condemnations of all these organizations. And now I'll briefly go over our main findings. So first, what is condemnation? What are the components of condemnation? This is really speech act driven analysis of statements of condemnation. So of course, each condemnation involves the performative marker. So condemnation, you don't have to use in diplomatic discourse condemnation. You can use denounce, concern, and there is, in matter of fact, a ladder or scale of condemnation from the less severe, we are concerned, worried about X, or the most harsh symbolic sanction in the form of harshly condemn. In addition to the performative marker, we found that condemnation, statements of condemnations include strategies to intensify the sense of transgressions, such as metaphor, ethnic cleansing, bloodbaths, etc., framing the transgressor. They all frame the transgressor as deviant, calling, for example, Israel as state terrorism. Established, very important to establish the condemned authority, so to preserve own authority to condemn, and an additional, most of the condemnations we analyzed included a call for action, a demand, urge, call to boycott, or to seize some policy. So this is the very descriptive level of analysis, and then we move to the functional analysis. We looked at the differences, how each of these organizations utilize the condemnation in its publications, and we found differences in styles or in the discourse of condemnation. So the Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, its main mission is to raising awareness, words perceived as public education. For the EU and the UN, words of condemnation are perceived as a way to take a stand. Words are perceived as symbolic sanctions. And for BDS, words are not enough. And this is why they stopped condemning and started to call for action in order to try and convince Israel to stop the occupation in Palestine. So again, moving very fast on our findings. This is the mission statement of B'Tselem, and their mission is very clear: to combat the phenomenon of denial prevalent among Israeli public and help create a human rights culture in Israel. And the specific strategy is to raise empathy with victims, providing personal information about the victims, and maintaining a balancing position, because they are part of the community, they are part of the Israeli community. They won't use any taboo terms such as Nazi, ghetto, or compare Israeli occupation to apartheid. For the EU and the UN, the role of condemnation is very clear, and this is coming from the EU mission statement. When faced with violation of human rights, the EU will make use of the full range of instruments at its disposal, including sanctions or condemnations. So both material and symbolic sanctions. And the EU kept on its role of arbitrator. And this could be seen as a balancing, a neutral arbitrator, fair arbitrator. So, and this is apparent in the publications in attributing blame to both sides, to show how the violations are determinantal to both sides, and of course preserving his formal language and authority. BDS, and here what the BDS, one of the statements write about condemnations, convinced that condemnation failed in holding Israel accountable, and the way to enforce compliance will be only by boycotting Israel. Nevertheless, they do use condemnations in half of their publications, and their publications include various strategies of demonization. I have to tell you that as an Israeli, Jewish Israeli, it was very hard to read some of these publications, especially the one that uses the Holocaust-related discourse, which are often used in these publications. And the main finding in relation to BDS is that they don't speak to Israelis. They don't speak to Israelis that would like to make a change. They speak to transnational audience, but exclude Israeli forces of change. So our conclusion is that epididic speech acts are efficient tool to study discourse and globalization, and more specifically, immorality, the spread of morality, the dissemination of morality in the global community. And on the base of this general observations, I decided to take a first look, and I have to say it's a very first look, and any comment will be appreciated. How much time do I have?
We have less speakers, so you got about 7 minutes.
Oh, thank you. So, building on the previous conclusions, I looked at the Russian case in order to see how European states, nations of the West, and all the rest responded to the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and how an identity was constructed through statements of condemnation, statements of support. So this is a very initial step, and I collected the first public responses of European states and institutions to the invasion, and the responses of other states, including superpowers and states that abstained or voted against the condemnation. So the first response, and also collected the responses after 3 months, so in 2 points in time. And on this data, on the basis of this data, I mapped the range of responses, the justifications for a specific response, why abstaining, why supporting, and so forth, in order to find out how epididic discourse construct moral affiliations around norms among political communities. So the rest of my talk, the 5 minutes I have, will be dedicated to show how the reactions create an appearance of unified European actor over space and over time. So let's start with over space. So the articulation of moral affiliation over space is apparent in both acts of condemning Russia and the overwhelming European support for the Ukraine. These responses were publicized in the first day of the war, marking a change from a diversity of stances at the eve of the invasion, diversity of stances toward Russia at the eve of the invasion, to more or less unified moral community during March 2022. A clear example could be found in the UN vote conducted in March 2nd. 141 states voted in favor of condemning Russia, while only 5 voted against. 35 abstained, 12 were absent, but you can see the overwhelming support, which include all European states. On March 15, the Italian the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the other Council of Europe leaders made the following statement: as leader of the Council of Europe, we expressed on several occasions our firm condemnation of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine, and so forth. So we see that in the first days of war, of the first day of the invasion, a unified voice is constructed, a moral community is constructed, and we see that to this general condemnation, other nations join to this orchestrated voice. So in Ireland, across Europe, we are united in our belief that Russia must face consequences for its legal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. In Germany, they call the invasion shameless breach of international law, and also in the Netherlands. Other states added a statement of support to this condemnation and send a message of unity and support for the Ukrainian people, and Boris Johnson, famous, "We are with you." We will talk at the conclusion, what is the meaning of "we are with you"? To this orchestrated voice of Europe, the unified voice of Europe, joined other Western countries that are identified with the West, like Japan, Colombia, and Australia, that joined this condemnation. So 141 states build a community, moral community of condemnation, but at the borders of this community, a new community emerged that bordered the expansion, to stop the expansion of the moral community that was constructed through condemnation. These several, although very few, countries included a statement of support of Russia, including Russia, Cuba, and Venezuela, or is it Bolivia, that believed that Russia should defend itself, supported the Russian narrative, the Russian case. So they've done so, by the way, for several reasons, including their own state, regional, material reason. I don't have the time to get into all these reasons, but it is clear that how a community of the West against the rest was constructed. And it is important to say that what I'm presenting here is a very general picture, and the picture itself is much more nuanced. And you can see, you can see a very clear division between us and them on the general side, but even among us, there is a diversity of voices on how to respond. And this diversity of voices could be seen in the cracks over time in the presentation of Europe as a unified actor. And 3 months into the war, we could see first challenges to this unified actor, and we saw a diversion of stances toward the severity of condemnation, the use of material sanctions, and the fate of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And I think you've mentioned, and it was mentioned in the early, on the one side, those who wanted to humiliate Russia and to, specifically Putin, humiliate, I'm saying in brackets, that saying that Putin cannot remain in power, and those who were against the humiliation of Russia and understanding that humiliation will be counterproductive. So these are my first mapping of the voices in Europe, how it was constructed, the cracks in the voices of unity across Europe. And just let me conclude with several remarks about, so a first look, we can see how condemnation and acts of solidarity create moral affiliations. But these moral affiliations holds for a very specific time when the consequences started to emerge. a deterioration in the support and in the condemnation in the hard stance could be seen. In spite of some variation, the construction and projection of unified actor in the first month was quite impressive. And the problem with such unity is in achieving it through rallying around a shared enemy, again, proving once again that war is an effective glue in maintaining and strengthening interstate relations. Both symbolic and material sanctions facilitate a sense of being brothers in arms. They created an appearance of collective that can rely on each other in an event of a perceived threat for survival, underlining once again the problematic link between nations and violence. So this is my final word, and we can discuss about the limits of condemnations in the limits of the limited power of words in the discussion, the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zohar, and everybody for your contributions. So, any questions? 1, 2, 3. Yes, let's start with, yes, you.
Good morning. My name is Kyriakos Mikelis, University of Macedonia. I thought I didn't need one. All three presentations were thought-provoking, but please allow me to pose a question to Professors Romero and Hatzivassiliou in rather poetic terms rather than analytical ones. I have a dream. I have a dream that in a genuinely integrated European Union, a Polish European will eventually say that relations with Turkey is her security problem, a Greek European that relations with Russia is her security problem, and that a Belgian European, supposedly that there is still Belgium, will say that the issues of Ceuta, Melilla, and Gibraltar are her security problem. Am I a dreamer?
Yes, you are.
Well, I'll say the same thing in different words. Let's say that it is a little early to have such dreams.
Okay, yes, Julian, and then Sam.
I have a comment to Evanthis and his description of German foreign policy, or rather the relatively reticence of the German government in this sense. What one shouldn't forget when you describe this is the absolute lack of energy and the dependence on other sources. And that's why Germany hesitated for a long time and treated Russia rather differently. And still large segments of the population, I'm German, by the way, so I speak for this, is we don't have any atomic power stations, unlike all other European nations, and no natural resources, etc. And that explains, I think, and you should take this into account when you describe this. And I also have a comment to Federico Romero. The rearmament of Germany, one should also not forget that there is a lot of resistance in the German population, particularly in my generation, given the atrocious past of Germany. And I don't know whether actually this massive rearmament will take place, given the resistance in the population. Just comments. You can answer this or... Okay.
It is not my intention to be excessively critical of our German friends and partners. My point is this. I fully understand the lack of energy resources in the case of Germany. My point was that Germany, after reunification, after the end of the Cold War, forgot how to make foreign policy. Okay, it doesn't have energy resources, but is it wise for a great power, because Germany is a great power even without the EU, is it wise for a great power to become so excessively dependent on another power, which is not the most friendly. Okay, look, in the 1990s or the 2000s, Russia was not a hostile state, but it is an uncontrollable factor. Is it wise to become so much dependent on a single source? At the invitation of Effie Pedaliou and Richard Smith, I took part in a project which studies the crisis over the West Siberian pipeline of 1982. At that time, the Americans tried to cripple the pipeline. They created a huge crisis within the Western Alliance. And their argument was that it would make Western Europe dependent on Soviet gas. In 1982, Germany was dependent for its energy, for the 5% of its energy consumption on Russian gas. 5%. And the projection was that by the end of the decade, it would rise to the unthinkable and unacceptable level of 15% dependence on Russian gas. Now it's 55. It is not a wise decision, my first point. My second point is, when I say that our German friends have forgotten to make foreign policy, okay, there was this declaration about the expansion of German military expenditure. This is a very incomplete thought. So when we have a problem, we spend more money? No, it's not enough. I mean, if you want to expand your military infrastructure, your military capabilities, you need to make an analysis. Who am I? Who are the possible opponents? How do I perceive the world? What do I want to do with this expansion? Do I want to deter somebody? In that case, I do not need supremacy. Do I want to do something else? I mean, the idea that when I have a problem, I announce an expansion of expenditure, well, not enough. The world does not work like that. So what I'm trying to say is that perhaps we have relaxed too much. That era is over, and we need slowly to start building again, first of all, our mental capabilities. I mean, what Federico said about the problems of coordination between NATO and the division of labor. And perhaps NATO may be responsible for a kind of atrophy in the case of the EU. Yes, all this is correct, but we need slowly to regain our capability to move in the wider world, not only to move in terms of within our continent in terms of democratization. This was a wise policy. It still has to go on. There are at least the Western Balkans to deal with. It is important, but it is not enough. This is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is my comment for question for Zohar. Thanks for a really interesting paper, presentation. I've got two questions really. One is on your analytical framework, and one is actually going back to your bit on Israel. In your framework, it seems like you can account really well for what we might call direct condemnations of actors and their actions. But at a rhetorical level, how can we maybe account for indirect condemnations? And by this I mean, for example, we agree with your aims, but we disagree with how you're getting there, right? Or, for example, yes, we can all agree that racism is bad, but we don't like you protesting in the streets. So there's a condemnation there, but it's softer. And the second question is going back to how you introduced B'Tselem as one of the actors in the Israeli context. Last year, they came out with a report where they actually explicitly used apartheid, right? But your paper, when you were writing your paper 2016, they were refusing to use the word apartheid. And I was just wondering sort of what happened internally within B'Tselem for them to change their mind of that use, and what was the backlash as well in terms of how did people understand the change in their strategy by using that term? Because it's obviously controversial.
To talk about B'Tselem?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
of course. Okay, thank you very much for both questions. So how do I approach indirect condemnations? The limit of a study, of my study, of this is in fact our study in the marketware, is that we used keyword searches in order to locate condemnations. But we didn't look just for the act, the performative marker of condemnation. We identified the full gamut of markers that indicate a critical stance toward another according to our working definition of what is condemnation. And then we looked for other texts. So we have a list of verbs starting from concern, denounce, condemn, worry, and so forth, which allowed us to collect clear condemnation, which some of them can definitely considered as indirect, as in concern or worry, because this is not direct condemnation. But we had enough, we have enough material to start to understand what condemnation is. However, I can't say that this is the all way humans have, all the strategies that can be used to condemnation. And we know that, speech acts are functional entities, and we can perform speech act in so many ways. So that is for the first point. The second point, there was a change. Just after we published the paper, the CEO of B'Tselem resigned from, Jessica Montel resigned from her position, and the new chair is new chair, new policy. And since 2016-17, B'Tselem started, and this is how it was reproached in Israeli discourse, to wash the laundry outside of the state, so to talk on the stages of the EU and the UN about Israeli violation of human rights, and to use words like apartheid. My guess, it's not my guess, I spoke with Jessica Montel, the former CEO who was against this strategy. And she said that this is a way to combat the indifference in Israeli society. So you have to provoke Israeli society in order to get a reaction. What a reaction is, this is a totally different issue. It's far back. It may boomerang, but this is the explanation for the change of policy.
Thank you very much. I have 3 points. My first point is about Germany. I very much agree with what has been said by our colleague. When we look at the debate in Germany, what is very interesting is, on one side, we see at the level of political elites, the level of experts, think tanks, DGAP, SVP, etc., a debate about, well, we have to invest more in defense, we have to devote more money. But when it goes to the public, it's completely different. Even when you talk with the backbencher at the level of in the Bundestag, a very different debate, because this is a society which is profoundly pacifist, right? And it's an interesting thing for the future of this 100 billion funding. The question of the societal legitimacy around the change. That's my first point. My second point Professor Romero said, well, it's strange that when we are, and I completely agree that we will have with Ukraine a re-legitimation of NATO. This is what's going on, but it's interesting that we have some difficulties in Europe to consider that. Well, maybe we could have a president in the United States which is not playing the game of liberal values, right? Because we had the experience of Trump, but even with this experience of Trump, our mental capability to accept that it could be a problem for the security of Europe and for the transatlantic relation is a very interesting question, I guess. Even when we had Trump, I remember the discussion, Germany again, well, we have to wait, we have to be patient, it will come back, etc. And it's true that it comes back with Biden, but we don't know. What about the next election? So it could be an argument. It should be an argument to reflect more on the importance of a European strategic autonomy, right? This factor, I guess. And my third point, I was not sure, Professor Hatzivassiliou, if I understood you well, but what you said at the end of your discourse on academic resources, and was your point about, well, we do not have enough research on EU foreign policy? That's a strange thing, because my impression, and again, maybe you have data, and I see more and more people in the field of EU studies working on foreign policy of the EU. When you go to big conferences like EUSA, for instance, well, you have a lot of presentations about various aspects of the external relations of the EU. Even if you look at what is published, so maybe I'm biased because I'm only thinking about political scientists. Maybe it's different for historians, but. Do you have data about that? It's an interesting point. Thank you.
I think, I mean, this is very difficult to say because we're just hypothesizing, but I think it's very obvious that the people in government throughout Europe are aware that things can go very wrong in the United States from a European perspective. They must be aware. They read the papers, they read the polls, they meet with Democrats and Republicans. But at the same time, in almost every public expression, they seem to not mention this risk, to sort of exorcise the risk. Except perhaps occasionally some French spokesperson, Macron a few years ago, but not recently, alluded to. But everybody else is, I don't think that is in denial in the real sense of the term, but certainly is very careful not to express anything that might portray this very negative scenario. But they must be thinking about it. So we have the paradox. For instance, I remember a couple of speeches of Mario Draghi at the beginning of the crisis. And I admire and esteem Mario Draghi immensely, but the way in which he was describing in very sort of Biden's type of terms, the democracy versus autocracy, polarity and the transatlantic link, etc., it sounded like he was speaking about JFK's America, not today's America. So there is something interesting there, at the same time slightly worrying in terms of this inability to bring into the public discussion the issue of what will America be 5 years from now, 3 years from now, 10 years from now. The second point, I think, here there is something that I think historians have done very good work. that relate to your debate about Germany and energy and Russia. Not only the level of German dependency, German, Italian, and many others, Austrians, etc., dependency from Russian gas was much lower, but they were also using their relationship to condition the Russians, the Soviets at the time, quite effectively, very effectively in many ways. One doesn't have the impression. It's true that once you move to dependency at 40% like Italy, 50% like Germany, it becomes very difficult to condition Putin by saying, I will buy less of your gas. But one has the impression that this was not tried, really, throughout the long Ukrainian crisis from 2014 onwards. Was there ever instances in which we said, listen, you guys need our technology to develop and maintain your gas pipelines and the pipeline system? You need us to buy increasing amounts of gas. We can very well decide to buy less if you do something that we don't like. One has the impression that we never tried that. But it's only an impression, I might be wrong. Perhaps also because it would entail the problem that we were discussing yesterday, that is, the EU relies by law and by political ideology, if you wish, on market relationship, especially within. Any type of diplomacy of this kind would have entailed the necessity for governments to intervene in the energy market, to take over maybe an energy company, as Germany just did, to control prices. And this is, for the EU, has become something that is totally unnatural, and therefore that probably they don't even consider it. They don't even put it on the table of their options when a crisis is looming up. But they should, because then once a war starts, you have to take these measures, and you better have them planned rather than improvise them.
My reference was mostly to European projects, research projects. Please allow me to say that I have never applied for a European research project, and I have my hands full. I do not plan to apply for one. I'm making a general observation. European, at least in the field of history, European research projects deal with everything else than foreign relations, especially the foreign relations of the member states or of a cluster of the member states. As you said that there are many, in international conferences, there are many papers on values aspects. Did I note it correctly? Values aspects of external relations of the EU. This is not foreign policy. This is the values aspects. Democratization, soft power. This is not foreign policy. I do not want to appear too Machiavellian or Kissingerian, but the values aspect is not really. I mean, of course, every policy will be based on values. But if you center on the values aspects, then you do not. I don't think you speak about foreign policy. Now, to make my point, I said before to Julian that the proclamation that Germany is going to spend money for a military expansion, this does not cover me. I do not think that at this moment Germany has the resources, the mental, the intellectual resources to plan for a sustained, integrated security policy. Where will they find the experts? What do they want to do? We did not listen did not hear what they wanted to do. So we're going to spend money. This is a response of the EU in the previous era. We're going to spend money and this is it. It's not enough. I may sound a bit traditionalist, but I'm afraid this is how these things work in the past 5,000 years. You need to know what to do. I'm not sure that our German friends know what to do with the money that they will pour into. And this is why I fully agree with Julian. I'm not quite sure that this, and with you, that this is going to be implemented in the end because, as you said very correctly, of the deficit of social legitimization for such a policy. You are absolutely correct.
I've got one more question. Yes, Professor Leconte.
Maybe just one point about like the European defense, and if we look at it in terms of spending money capabilities, I think we are spending a lot of money. We are even spending much more like than Russia in terms of also military capabilities. Even for Germany, they are exporting a lot of weapons all over the world. So we have that kind of capabilities without looking at the future. So we already have it. Main issue is for us the interoperability of this of the military forces, and NATO is the one able to do that kind of coordination. So I think it's really like a systemic issue that we are not coordinating and have this interoperability of our capabilities. But on top of that, I think the main point, but that's something that has been raised many times, is where Russia makes really a big difference is on nuclear weapons and their capabilities on that point. That's really where they make a difference. On all other topics, I mean, in terms of human capabilities, sophistication, and so on. Clearly, even Europe, without NATO, would have that kind of capabilities. We are spending much more than Russia, but the nuclear capabilities is really what makes a big difference.
Well, I fully agree with you that it is very dangerous to try to humiliate a nuclear power. There may be very great contradictions in it. Military aid to the Ukraine cannot substitute an integrated, comprehensive European foreign and security policy. However, I mean, okay, we give aid to the Ukraine. Greece has also given a lot of things, but this cannot substitute the whole point. Now, there is something else that we need to take into account. The function of the EU and of NATO are, as we know, almost opposite in direction. NATO as an intergovernmental alliance is based on unanimity. The EU is based on coordination, isn't it? I mean,
when it works.
When it works, but the task is coordination. Now, you say the word coordination in NATO and the whole structure will fall down. They will not allow any coordination. Because it is intergovernmental, it is based on the concept of unanimity. There are veto powers. I'm not quite sure that our societies, certainly the Greek society is not aware of these differences, but I'm not sure that our Western societies are generally aware. We need to make very difficult balancing acts within our societies, between ourselves, and of course with Russia. We're again in the good old game of international politics.
Thank you. I suppose there are no other questions at this stage, so we'll break, and there is lunch served on the 8th floor, and then we start off with the second day parallel sessions at 1:30 in the different rooms of this building. So thank you all very much.